Thelonious Alone in San Francisco is just one of many albums that showed how insane this man is at his piano. It's not a stretch to say Monk is one of the best pianists ever. He can do it all. He can play with intensity and soothe you at the same time. This album is one of his calmest, which I like, but I also enjoy some of his other stuff a bit more. I think the biggest thing that holds this back is that Monk is alone, without his usual collaborators like Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane. This is just Monk and his piano, and it is technically impressive and quite calming. But I wouldn't say this is one of my favorite Monk albums, simply because I know what he's capable of when his piano is paired with some other impressive instruments.
Vou contar com a minha nota como eu gosto de você.
O Amor, O Sorriso y a Flor is one of João Gilberto's best albums. I don't know if I pronounced any of that right, but I'm American, so yeah, I've never been a massive fan of Gilberto's style of bossa nova. I much prefer Carlos Jobims and Nara Leos, but I won't deny how good Gilberto is. This one especially is soothing, chill, and just so mellow. It's one of the earliest examples of just pure vibes being created by music. That's basically the entirety of bossa nova, but this one especially is one of the most relaxing albums of the genre. Gilberto's voice still isn't my favorite. I usually prefer a girl singing in my bossa nova at the end of the day, but this is one of his better vocal performances. This is only 20 minutes, but its short runtime still makes you feel at ease more than most bossa nova albums. I am quite a big Bill Evans fan, and you're going to see that in my future lists, but I'm going to be honest, it took me an annoyingly long time to get into Portrait in Jazz. It's one of his earlier albums, and I still don't think he totally figured out his style. It's not as soothing and calming as Undercurrent or Moonbeams, and that does hurt it at times, but this album is still pretty damn chill. Evans is just a phenomenal pianist, and creates a feeling of mellowness that very few pianists can. Even Monk can't touch this level of chill. This album creates the blueprint that future Evans albums make a whole lot better, but the original source is still pretty solid on its own. If you can't tell already, I'm a pretty big jazz fan. I like a ton of other genres, obviously. Jazz isn't even my favorite, but this year was incredibly strong for jazz and weak for pretty much every other genre. Mingus Dynasty is another great jazz album. I mean, obviously it is. It's Charles Mingus. It's nowhere near my favorite Mingus album, but it's still mad energetic and technically impressive the entire album. He's one of the best bassists of all time, and he creates such unique and just mind-blowing pieces of music. His artistry is matched by very few, and this is not the first time you're going to see him on this list, as it was a pretty productive year for Mingus. Yeah, back-to-back Mingus albums. Blues and Roots is slightly better than Mingus Dynasty. It's another super intense and fun album, and I know a lot of people consider this one of his best. I think it's great, but I've never fully been on that train. Once again, his talents are shown on an insane level. It's incredibly complex, and when he's in the zone, your mind will be blown. It's not as avant-garde and unique as some other Mingus albums, which is why I don't love it as much. It's pretty standard post-bop and hard bop, with some cool weird shit occasionally, but it's pretty accessible. But it's also pretty great. It is Mingus after all, and it made my top 10, so I do love this album quite a bit. In fact, it's pretty hard not to. There's not much flaws. The top 5 albums this year are on another level, and The Big Beat by Art Blakey is the most underrated. I've always been a massive Art Blakey fan. His music is just so fun and positive, it gets me bopping every time. He's an unbelievable drummer that has such raw passion and energy and puts it into every track. I don't love this as much as Mosaic or Monin, but it's still super entertaining. Blakey rarely gets put in best jazzer of all time talks, and I think that's just because he doesn't have as much albums, but quality over quantity in my opinion, and Blakey is just as good as the Miles Davises and the John Coltranes of the world, just not in this particular year. Sketches of Spain was the Miles Davis album that took me the longest to really love. I've never been a massive fan of Spanish music. It has to really wow me to make me connect with it, and that's exactly what this album does. Davis incorporated classic Spanish-style music into his usual mellow and soothing style of jazz, and it's absolutely incredible. When you really listen to this thing, it's hard not to just be equally confused and impressed by what Miles does on this album. The opening track is one of Miles' best, but the whole album is technically impressive and super enjoyable. It does get pretty lonely and isolated, but its lush and just beautiful atmosphere pulls me in every single time. This has come to be one of my favorite Miles albums over the years, and I bet I'll like it even more in the future. Hank Mobley can play the shit out of that saxophone, and Soul Station has to be my favorite of his. I love Roll Call and No Room for Squares, but Soul Station is one of the hardest hard bop albums like ever. It is pretty soulful, but really this thing just has me smiling and moving my head the entire time. Of course Blakey is on here, and he is obviously incredible as always, but I'd argue Soul Station is just as good or even better than any Art Blakey album. It's hard to even put into words why I like this album so much. It really just makes me feel good, and that's more than enough to put it in my top 3. Giant Steps is one of Coltrane's best albums, and the title track is one of his best songs. I'm a massive Coltrane fan. I think he's probably the GOAT of jazz, and just one of the best musicians ever. He's incredibly influential and important in the history of music, but all of his stuff has just aged to perfection. It's fun, intense, incredibly impressive, and just mind-blowing if I could describe it in one phrase. Giant Steps is just an example of a master of his craft doing what he does best. It's not his best, but it definitely has an argument and is one of my favorite ones to just put on. It is pretty important and groundbreaking, even compared to other Coltrane albums. The title track is even considered the most feared song of jazz due to its insanely complex and fast tempo, often known as the hardest song in the entire genre. But Coltrane just does it all so effortlessly, and it makes it one of the most technically impressive albums of all time. The Incredible Jazz Guitar of Wes Montgomery is one of the jazz albums I have the deepest personal connection to. On first listen, I was just blown away by Montgomery and how much passion and energy he puts into his music. He's the best jazz guitarist of all time, and it's not really close. I love Grant Green, don't get me wrong, but Wes Montgomery can make me feel something with his instrument on a level very few can do. It's so calming, soothing, and just gives off such a warm feeling that I just can't get enough of. The whole album is amazing, but Aragorn has to be my favorite, and just one of my favorite jazz songs in general. The album makes me feel like I'm at a jazz club, just chilling and relaxing, and it's one of the few things that puts me at complete and total peace. But at the same time, I'm also just in absolute shock and amazement by Montgomery and his insane talent, and the whole thing is just musical perfection. A jazzer being ranked above Coltrane won't happen often, but Montgomery creates an atmosphere and invokes feelings in me that very few artists have ever been able to do on this album, and I think that's more than enough for me to put The Incredible Jazz Guitar of Wes Montgomery at number 1.